In this video, I thought we'd talk about something interesting, and that's the topic of sleep paralysis. My name is Kevin Tokoph of Catalyst University. Now, sleep paralysis is something that has personally happened to me. It's not common, it's very rare. It actually happened, though, about 3 weeks ago. And so I thought around that time, maybe I'll put this little video together explaining how it works. So we're going to talk about some basic facts about sleep paralysis on this page, and then in a few minutes we'll go into the mechanism of how it actually works, talking about it on a physiological, even down to a biochemical level. It turns out that even though it's not completely elucidated 100%, there's some pretty good working hypotheses about how it actually works, or doesn't work, as we may find out. So how can we define sleep paralysis? Well, it's a state during waking up or falling asleep in which a person is aware, that is, they can see, their vision is acute at that point, maybe a little blurry, but they can definitely see, but they're unable to move and they're unable to speak. Now, being unable to move is because muscles are paralyzed. That's obvious from the name sleep paralysis. It's actually because sleep paralysis occurs at the onset of waking just after REM sleep. And if you've watched the videos in my playlist here over the sleep cycle, in REM sleep, there's normal muscle paralysis, something we'll call atonia. And so at the onset of waking up just after REM sleep, sometimes those muscles don't unparalyze. That's what we'll be talking about in the second half of this video. And then inability to speak, well, you need muscles to talk. So if your muscles are paralyzed, you can't talk. And also it's worth noting that hearing or audition and then just general sensation, feeling things on your skin, somatosensation, those sometimes are present as well. Now, for sleep paralysis, if we talk about an individual episode, they're usually going to last for a couple of minutes or even less. They don't last long, fortunately. They may be isolated cases, as mine was a few weeks ago, but some people actually get recurrent cases of these, maybe not every night, but it happens fairly frequently. And actually, between about 80 and 50% of all people will experience sleep paralysis at some point in your life. So if you haven't experienced it yet, there's a good chance you might eventually. About 5% of these people who experience it have regular episodes, and there's really no discrimination between males and females. Now, individuals who suffer from sleep paralysis will often indicate that they have hallucinations. Hallucinations are probably the thing that are most closely tied to sleep paralysis. The first type of hallucination is really just a belief that there's an intruder in the room. A lot of times you can see those intruders. A lot of times a dark figure or a shadow figure, something that may indicate a danger. Also, the presence of an incubus or a succubus. These are often things that people have experienced during these hallucinations. Now, in terms of these two types of hallucinations, the major hypothesis here is that during sleep paralysis, because the brain has more or less woken up, even though the muscles are paralyzed, the brain's woken up, so there's the activation of a threat-activated vigilance system. So this is a system in the brain that's designed as a protective mechanism to differentiate between dangerous situations and ultimately determine if a fear response is appropriate. And so in individuals who wake up with sleep paralysis, this emergency response is activated in the brain. And it's activated because you're paralyzed. I mean, I'd be pretty scared too if I were paralyzed and I couldn't move, and I would feel vulnerable to attack. And it's thought that this sense of helplessness intensifies all sorts of different sensations, whether it's vision, whether it's audition, somatosensation. All sorts of senses are playing tricks on you, and you may actually hallucinate. And it's all due to the activation of that threat-activated vigilance system. Okay. The third type of hallucination is a sensation of floating, basically kind of an out-of-body experience. Now, the major hypothesis with this type of hallucination is that the mechanisms that normally coordinate body movement and provide information on body positions, such as different kinds of proprioceptors, they become activated. But there's no actual movement, so it induces a floating sensation. Very, very strange indeed. And I can honestly say that I've never had the third kind of hallucination, but the first two, I can say that I've had those. Very, very scary stuff. So all those factoids are cool and all, but the question remains, what exactly is sleep paralysis? Now before we go any further into this, understand that the exact mechanism is not 100% elucidated. However, there is one very strong hypothesis about what exactly causes sleep paralysis. But before we go into that, we need to understand a few scientific things about it. So first of all, sleep paralysis is thought to be an error during REM sleep, and really at the end of REM sleep, just before waking up. Okay? So we have a sleep cycle. We talked about that in a previous video. And we go through 4 to 5 cycles normally of non-REM sleep and then REM sleep. And then once again, non-REM sleep and then REM sleep. And we do that roughly 4 or 5 times during the night. And then a lot of times at the end of REM sleep, we wake up. Or basically we cut REM sleep short and we wake up. Now what happens if there's an error in that final transition between REM sleep and waking up? So what is REM sleep? Well, we talked about the typical sleep cycle in a previous video, and recall that usually in a typical sleep cycle we cycle between non-REM sleep and REM sleep roughly 4 to 5 times. So one cycle would be non-REM sleep, REM sleep. Then we do that a second time, non-REM sleep and then REM sleep. And we do that 4 to 5 times. And then in the final cycle of sleep, so it could be cycle 4, cycle 5, depending on your particular sleep cycle, you're going to go through one final REM stage of sleep. And at the very end of that, there's going to be a transition between REM sleep and waking up. That's when sleep paralysis occurs. It occurs at the interface between the last REM cycle of sleep and waking up. But there's a couple things that are important to take into account that are characteristic of REM sleep, other than the fact that it's rapid eye movement. And those are an EEG right here, which is an electroencephalogram. This gives a measure of the brain activity, and then an EMG or electromyogram, a measure of muscle activity. And what you can see right here is there's a lot of brain activity as measured by this EEG. So in REM sleep, the brain is highly active. Not so much active in non-REM sleep, very inactive. And the further you go into non-REM sleep, the less active the brain becomes. Brain's very active during REM sleep, as you can see here, but according to the EMG, there's no muscular activity at all. In fact, the only muscles that are active are really going to be the breathing or respiratory muscles like the diaphragm. Obviously, we need to breathe when we're at all stages of sleep, otherwise we die. But every other muscle that we're talking about, so the biceps, the latissimus dorsi, every muscle that you would normally think of, they're all paralyzed. Okay? No muscle activity during REM sleep. Well, I want you to think about something for a minute. What would happen if we're in REM sleep and we're just about to wake up, but for some reason we don't get any more muscle activity? When we wake up, we should get muscle activity. That should be restored. But we don't get that restoration of muscle activity. Well, that's what happens in sleep paralysis. But to understand what's going on in sleep paralysis, we need to understand the basic physiology of REM sleep. So here's a basic diagram of all the events that are going on in normal physiology, no sleep paralysis, so during REM sleep. This part up here on the right side, we're going to ignore that pathway for a minute. That has to do with the red nucleus. And we're going to jump down here to this region of the brainstem, and this is actually the subceruleus, okay? Sub-C or subceruleus. So during REM sleep, there's some nuclei here in the subceruleus. They're glutamatergic. That means that they release glutamate. And they release glutamate in order to activate or excite these neurons here in the ventral medial medulla, or VMM. In other words, the subceruleus activates or excites the VMM basically by releasing glutamate. It tells us here they're glutamatergic. And then that causes the VMM, or ventral medial medulla, neurons to become active. And when the ventral medial medulla neurons become active, they actually inhibit motor neurons. Now let's recall what a motor neuron is. Okay, motor neurons are the neurons that cause muscles to contract. So when we think about your biceps brachii or latissimus dorsi or anything like that, muscles that you would think of moving around with, okay, those muscles have to have input from a motor neuron. And when the motor neuron activates, the muscle contracts. And so what we see here is that under normal physiological conditions during REM sleep, the ventral medial medulla is inhibiting these motor neurons, okay? And by inhibiting these motor neurons, you inhibit muscle contraction. So once again, subceruleus activates the ventral medial medulla. But the ventral medial medulla, these neurons by nature are inhibitory. So when they become active, they're able to inhibit the motor neurons that control skeletal muscle, and so they're able to inhibit muscle contraction. And this, again, is going to occur for the vast majority of skeletal muscle. Again, there are exceptions like the respiratory muscles, thoracic diaphragm, and the intercostal muscles, although we do see some decrease in their activity. But the point is most muscles are going to be paralyzed. And this is a state which we call atonia. And so this is the mechanism by which we produce that atonia. Okay. Now a few other things here just to mention. There are some muscle twitches that can occur in the middle of the night, even during REM sleep, and those are going to be facilitated by the red nucleus. Notice the red nucleus all the way up here is going to be able to provide input to those motor neurons down in the spinal cord. But generally speaking, the ventral medial medulla is going to be able to even inhibit those. So pretty much we have total atonia during REM sleep. So let's ask the first question right here. How specifically does the ventral medial medulla inhibit the skeletal muscle motor neurons? And we're going to see in just a second that there's two types of neurons here. There's a metabotropic GABA B type of neuron, and there's an ionotropic GABA A/glycine type of neuron. Both of these neurons constitute the inhibitory neurons that are going to inhibit these motor neurons. So here's the general setup right here, and understand this region right here is going to be in the spinal cord where my mouse is. But over here we have this red neuron. This is an upper motor neuron. It's ultimately coming from the brain, particularly the cerebral cortex, even more specifically the precentral gyrus. And so if this muscle fiber down here was in, let's say, the biceps brachii, then this upper motor neuron that's coming from the cerebral cortex would be sending the muscles information that say, hey, this muscle fiber in the biceps brachii needs to contract. So in other words, you have to have conscious input from the brain. So here's an upper motor neuron, and when this upper motor neuron becomes activated, it can then activate this lower motor neuron. This lower motor neuron in dark green, that is the motor neuron that's going to be activating the skeletal muscle. Okay? And then when this neuron becomes activated, you get muscle contraction. However, during REM sleep, remember we said that these neurons in the ventral medial medulla are active. And this one in lighter green right here on the left, this is the metabotropic GABA B neuron. This one right here on the right, the gold one, is the ionotropic GABA A glycine neuron. Okay? Now in this case right here, they're both active, and so they're both able to produce this inhibition on the lower motor neuron right here. And as long as these two neurons are both active, the lower motor neuron remains inactive, and therefore the muscles also remain inactive, and you have atonia. So this is what's normally happening during REM sleep. Okay? Even if you had input from this upper motor neuron, the lower motor neuron wouldn't function, it wouldn't activate because these two neurons in the ventral medial medulla are activated. Now, during normal waking, these two neurons ought to be inactive, right? Because during waking, there ought to be some mechanism, and there is, to actually turn off these neurons from the ventral medial medulla. So the metabotropic GABA B neurons turn off, the ionotropic GABA A glycine neurons turn off, and when these are both off, they're no longer able to inhibit the lower motor neuron, and therefore you should be able to contract this muscle. So you should have tonia, or just normal muscle contraction. And so under normal conditions, when we are in REM sleep, we have atonia. But notice, here's the onset of waking right here. At the onset of waking, these two neurons should turn off in the ventral medial medulla to release their inhibition on the lower motor neuron, and therefore we should return to being able to contract the muscle. And so contraction is indicated by this purple color right here. However, in the case of sleep paralysis, as you see right here, we still have atonia during REM sleep, but at the onset of waking right here, we don't immediately get muscle contraction back. There's still this atonia. And then maybe at some point right here after a couple minutes, we return to getting muscle contraction. But there's an error right here at the onset of waking. And the major hypothesis there is that either both of these neurons or one of them fails to turn off. And so this lower motor neuron remains inactive and we still have atonia. So this segment of time right here after the onset of waking, before muscle contraction returns, this is your sleep paralysis. Now there was a study that was done, and I'll put the link to it in the description, that actually looked at this, where they selectively knocked out, or at least inhibited, one of these neurons, then they selectively knocked out the other one, and then they knocked out both of them and looked at the effects. And what they found is that when they inhibited only the metabotropic GABA B neuron, you still had atonia. Okay? So they inhibited this neuron. However, even though it's inhibited, they still had inhibition of the lower motor neuron here and no muscle contraction, so there was still atonia. Then they did the same thing with the other neuron here, the ionotropic GABA A glycine neuron. They inhibited this one and still allowed the other one to be active. And you still have inhibition of the lower motor neuron right here, and so there's still atonia. And then they knocked out both of them. They knocked out both of these, and both of them being inhibited was enough to release that inhibition in the lower motor neuron. So that way the lower motor neuron can become activated and then you can have muscle contraction. So this study allowed them to generate a hypothesis that basically says that this sleep paralysis that occurs after you wake up, where you have prolonged atonia, has to do with the fact that there's some error upon waking where both of these neurons that are coming from the ventral medial medulla do not get inhibited. They have to both be inhibited at the same time in order to get rid of the atonia so that you can contract muscles again. But when only one of them is inhibited, and it doesn't matter which one is inhibited, it could be this gold one or it could be the green one. If only one of them is inhibited and the other one is allowed to be active, you inhibit this lower motor neuron and you have atonia. And that's going to be the major hypothesis for what drives sleep paralysis. So at some point when you have the onset of waking, atonia continues, which is sleep paralysis, because something is preventing one or both of these neurons from turning off. And so that's keeping this lower motor neuron inhibited, and then muscle contraction is also inhibited. So hopefully this video gave you a good, decent understanding of the mechanism of sleep paralysis. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel for future videos and notifications. Thank you very much.